In 480 BCC, the fate of Greece hung by a thread. From the east, the mighty Persian Empire advanced, led by King Xerxes, whose army was said to blot out the sun. Against this endless tide of men and metal stood a single king, Leonidas of Sparta, and just 300 warriors at his side. What they lacked in number, they made up for in resolve. To them, honor was not a word. It was the breath of life. Thermopylae was no ordinary battlefield. It was a narrow pass between mountain and sea, a natural funnel where the Persians could not bring their numbers to bear. Leonidas chose it not for comfort, but for destiny. He knew his men would not return, but they would hold the line long enough for Greece to unite. The Spartans stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears raised, their crimson cloaks whipping in the wind like banners of defiance. For 2 days, wave after wave of Persian soldiers crashed against them, only to break upon the Spartan wall. Arrows darkened the skies, spears shattered. The air was filled with the sound of bronze against flesh, steel against will. Yet the line did not break. The discipline of Sparta was absolute. Every man moved as if guided by a single heartbeat. The pass became a graveyard of Persian ambition. But victory, as history often reminds us, has a price. A Greek trader named Ephialtes revealed a hidden path through the mountains, a trail that would allow Xerxes to outflank the defenders. When word reached Leonidas, he did not curse fate. He accepted it. He ordered most of his allies to withdraw, saving their lives so they could fight another day. Only his 300 Spartans and a few hundred loyal Thespians and Thebans remained. That night, knowing dawn would bring death, Leonidas walked among his men. There were no speeches, no tears, only nods of understanding between warriors who had already accepted immortality. They sharpened their blades, repaired their armor, and looked toward the mountains where the torches of the Persian army glowed like stars. When morning came, the Spartans advanced one last time. They fought with broken spears, with swords worn to the hilt, and when even those failed, with their bare hands. They fought not for victory, but for legend. Arrows rained down. The sky turned black. Leonidas fell beneath a storm of iron, his body pierced, his spirit unyielding. His last command was simple: stand. Xerxes, enraged by their defiance, ordered Leonidas's body to be desecrated, his head displayed for all to see. But the gesture achieved the opposite. Across Greece, the story of Thermopylae spread like wildfire. Men spoke of the 300 not as victims, but as heroes who stood against impossible odds. Their sacrifice gave Greece the courage to unite, and within a year, the Persians were driven back into the sea. Leonidas did not die for conquest or crown. He died so that free men could choose their fate. In death, he became more than a king. He became the embodiment of defiance, the living proof that courage can outlast empires. Even now, over 2,000 years later, the name Leonidas echoes through time. The mountain pass of Thermopylae remains sacred ground, where legend and history intertwine. Tourists walk where warriors once stood, and the wind that passes through those cliffs still seems to whisper his words, "Malon Lab, come and take them." For in that narrow place between earth and sea, one man and his 300 proved a truth that no army, no empire could ever erase. That freedom, once claimed by the brave, can never be conquered. In the spring of 44 BCC, Rome was the center of the world. Its legions had conquered continents, its wealth stretched from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Gaul. And at its heart stood one man, Julius Caesar. To his supporters, he was the savior of Rome. To his enemies, he was the end of it. Caesar had done the unthinkable. He crossed the Rubicon River with his army, defied the Senate, and seized power in a single sweep of genius and audacity. He was brilliant, ruthless, magnetic, and unstoppable. The republic that had stood for centuries was now bending under his will. He reformed laws, rebuilt cities, and forgave former enemies. Yet behind every act of generosity, the Senate saw only ambition. Caesar was no longer first among equals. He was becoming a king in everything but name. Rome had not known a king for 500 years. The very word was poison. The Senate, once the guardian of freedom, now trembled in fear. Conspirators began to whisper. Among them were some of Caesar's closest allies, Brutus, Cassius, Decimus, men who had marched with him, eaten at his table, and sworn loyalty to him. But loyalty in the politics of Rome was as fragile as marble. They convinced themselves that by killing Caesar, they would save the Republic. The Ides of March dawned bright and calm. Caesar, warned by soothsayers to beware the day, laughed it off. He was too rational, too proud, to believe in omens. His wife Calpurnia begged him to stay home after dreaming of his death, but duty called him to the Senate. Surrounded by friends, he entered the theater of Pompey, unaware that it would become his calm. The moment he sat down, the trap was sprung. One senator approached with a petition. Another grabbed his shoulder. Then came the first stab. Confusion turned to horror as blades flashed in every direction. Caesar fought back at first, shielding himself with his toga. But there were too many. The conspirators circled him like wolves. Each thrust was personal, each cut a betrayal. When he saw Brutus among them, the man he loved like a son, Caesar stopped resisting. The words he spoke, or perhaps only thought, would echo through history. Et tu, Brute? Then fall, Caesar. He collapsed at the base of Pompey's statue, a cruel irony. The conqueror of nations, slain at the feet of the man he once defeated. 23 wounds marked his body, but it was not the knives that killed him. It was the betrayal of Rome itself. The Senate that claimed to defend liberty had murdered the only man capable of holding the Republic together. Outside, chaos erupted. The people mourned, then raged. Antony, Caesar's loyal general, carried his bloodied cloak before the crowd, his voice trembling with fury. He turned Caesar's death into a revolution. When he cried out that this was not justice but murder, the mob rose like fire. The conspirators fled for their lives. Within months, Rome descended into civil war, the very nightmare they claimed to prevent. Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, took up his cause. With cold patience, he avenged his uncle and reshaped Rome into something entirely new. The Republic the senators died to save was gone forever. In its place stood the Roman Empire, ruled by emperors who bore Caesar's name. The daggers that struck in the Senate that day did not protect freedom. They destroyed it. And so the death of Julius Caesar was not the death of a man. It was the death of an idea, the dream that power could be shared, that one nation could govern itself through reason and debate. What followed was empire, eternal and absolute, built on the blood of the man who made it possible. Centuries later, his name still carries the weight of destiny. Kaiser, Tsar, Caesar, all born from him. In his rise, the world saw the brilliance of ambition. In his fall, the price of greatness. The Ides of March became more than a date on a calendar. It became a warning, whispered through history, that even the most powerful man alive cannot escape the blade of envy, nor the judgment of time. For Julius Caesar conquered the world, but could not conquer the fear that lives in every heart that holds power. In the golden heart of Rome, where ambition was the only true god, one man rose above them all, Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the wealthiest man in the Republic, a titan of business and politics. a name that echoed through the marble halls of power. His fortune was legendary, his influence immense. Yet for all his gold, Crassus hungered for something far greater glory. He had watched his partners, Julius Caesar and Pompey, bask in the radiance of military triumph. Pompey had conquered the East. Caesar had tamed Gaul. Crassus, though richer than both, was mocked as a banker, a man of coin rather than courage. The whispers stung his pride. To silence them, he sought a battlefield worthy of his ambition. His eyes turned east, toward the rising empire of Parthia, a land of horsemen, deserts, and endless horizons. In 53 BCE, Crassus led 7 legions across the Euphrates River, confident that his wealth and Roman steel would crush the Parthians with ease. His soldiers marched beneath the blazing sun, their armor glinting like molten fire. But fortune does not bow to gold. The Parthians were masters of mounted warfare, swift, silent, deadly. They struck like ghosts, their horse archers releasing clouds of arrows from impossible distance. The Roman formations faltered, shields locked, men fell by the hundreds. The sun turned the battlefield into a furnace. Still, Crassus pressed on, blinded by pride, deaf to reason. His son Publius, young and brave, led a cavalry charge to break the enemy line. The Parthians pretended to flee, drawing him deep into the desert. When the trap closed, Publius and his men vanished in a storm of dust and death. The boy's head was raised on a spear and carried before the Roman lines. When Crassus saw it, despair finally pierced his armor of arrogance. His legions, once unbreakable, began to crumble. Surrounded and exhausted, Crassus was forced into negotiations. The Parthian general, Serena, mocked his greed, offering him a golden cup as a symbol of peace. But it was no truce. Crassus was seized. What happened next would become one of history's most infamous endings. Ancient writers tell of molten gold poured down his throat, a punishment as poetic as it was cruel. Whether myth or truth, the message was eternal. The man who worshipped wealth was consumed by it. The richest man in Rome died choking on the very symbol of his ambition. His death did not end with his body. It sent shockwaves through Rome. The fragile balance between Caesar and Pompey shattered. Suspicion turned to rivalry, rivalry to war. Within years, the Republic collapsed in civil bloodshed, and the age of emperors began. Crassus had sought immortality through conquest. Instead, he became a cautionary tale. His greed for glory destroyed not only himself, but the political world he helped build. Rome lost more than a general that day, in the sand of Carrhae. It lost its last chance at unity. And so, the man who owned half of Rome left behind nothing but a legacy of ruin. His wealth could buy armies, but not wisdom. His ambition could conquer cities, but not fate. In the silence of that distant desert, the wind still whispers his lesson that gold cannot buy greatness, and pride cannot cheat death. Marcus Crassus had everything a man could desire. And in the end, that was the very reason he lost it all. In the early 15th century, France was a nation on its knees. The 100 Years' War had drained its strength. English banners flew across its cities, and the French crown seemed all but lost. Into this chaos stepped an unlikely savior, not a noble, not a soldier, but a teenage girl from the village of Domremy. Her name was Joan. History would remember her as Joan of Arc. From the moment she first spoke of her visions, few believed her. She claimed that voices from heaven had chosen her to drive the English from France and crown Charles, the rightful heir, as king. To the clergy she was blasphemous, to the nobles absurd, but to the desperate she was hope. Dressed in armor, carrying a banner instead of a sword, Joan rode at the head of armies twice her size. Her faith was her weapon. her conviction, her shield. At Orléans, she broke the siege that had strangled the city for months. Her courage turned fear into fury. Hardened soldiers followed her into battle, as if led by divine light. Within a year, Charles was crowned King of France in Reims, just as Joan had foretold. She stood beside him, a peasant girl, turned into a symbol of destiny. Yet the same crown she helped place upon his head would soon abandon her. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English in 1430, Joan was sold for silver. Her enemies wanted more than victory. They wanted her legend destroyed. She was put on trial for heresy, witchcraft, and the sin of wearing men's clothing. The courtroom was not a place of justice, but a stage for humiliation. Dozens of priests questioned her for hours each day, twisting her words, searching for blasphemy, where there was only conviction. But Joan never broke. When they asked if she heard voices, she answered simply, yes, the voices of saints. When they mocked her visions, she told them that what she did for God, not for men. She was 19 years old, chained, exhausted, and surrounded by enemies. Yet her faith remained unshaken. On the morning of May 30th, 131, Joan was led to the marketplace of Rouen. A wooden stake stood waiting, surrounded by kindling. She prayed softly as the crowd gathered, some jeering, some weeping. The executioner tied her hands and lit the pyre. Flames climbed her legs, her body, her banner of purity turning to smoke. Witnesses said she did not scream until the fire reached her heart. Her last word was, Jesus. When it was done, her ashes were thrown into the river to erase her from memory. But the attempt failed. The fire that consumed her body only forged her spirit into something eternal. Her death transformed her from heretic to martyr, from peasant to saint. The English had hoped to silence her name forever. Instead, they gave it to history. 25 years later, a retrial declared her innocent. Centuries after, the Church canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc. To France, she became more than a warrior. She was the soul of the nation, courage in its breastion. Her story is not one of defeat, but of transcendence. For even as the flames rose around her, Joan's faith burned brighter than any fire that sought to destroy her. She proved that conviction can move armies, that belief can outlast death, and that the greatest victories are born not from steel and blood, but from unshakable faith. And so, the girl who once rode through battle beneath a white banner rides still in the memory of a nation reborn through her sacrifice. Joan of Arc did not die at Rouen. She was transformed there, from mortal to myth, from soldier to the saint, from fire to the light. In the age of knights and crusaders, when kingdoms were built on steel and faith, few names carried the weight of legend, like Richard the Lionheart, King of England, warrior of Christendom, conqueror of castles. His very presence commanded awe. To his men, he was courage made flesh. To his enemies, he was a storm wrapped in armor. But fate, as always, has a way of humbling even the mightiest. Richard spent most of his reign not in England, but in war. From the sands of the Holy Land to the forests of France, his sword carved his name into history. He was tall, fierce, and restless, a man who lived for battle more than for crown. During the Third Crusade, he faced Saladin, the great Muslim leader, in a clash that shaped legends. Though neither could defeat the other, both earned something rarer than victory: respect. When the truce was signed, Richard returned home not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of chivalry itself. Yet the road home was long and perilous. Captured and ransomed by enemies, betrayed by allies, Richard's later years were marked by endless struggle. Still, he remained defiant, driven by a need to reclaim what he believed was rightfully his. In 1199, During a campaign to suppress a rebellion in France, he came to a small fortress, Châlus-Chabrol, a place of little importance, yet it would become the stage of his final act. As Richard surveyed the walls, a crossbowman appeared atop the battlements, mocking the king. Smiling at the insolence, Richard rode closer, daring the man to shoot. The bolt flew and struck his shoulder. At first it seemed a minor wound. He laughed it off, even pulling the arrow out himself. But infection knows no rank, and in the days that followed, fever began to burn through the Lionheart's body. Even as death crept in, Richard showed no mercy. He called for the archer who had shot him to be brought before him. The man, trembling, expected torture or execution. Instead, the dying king looked at him with weary eyes and said, "You have done your duty as a soldier. I forgive you. Go free." It was his last act of mercy. Soon after, the infection claimed him. On April 6, 1199, the Lionheart's roar fell silent. His mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, buried him at Fontevraud Abbey, beside his father. His heart was placed separately in Rouen, near the land he fought so fiercely to protect. But the legacy of Richard could not be contained in stone or tomb. His death shocked Europe. The warrior king, whose sword had defended faith and crown alike, had fallen not in glorious battle, but to a single, random shot. It was the cruel irony of destiny that the man who faced 1,000 enemies on the battlefield would be undone by one arrow fired from a castle wall. And yet, in that irony lay a truth. Richard's greatness was never about how he died, but how he lived. His valor defined an age. His mercy defined a soul. In life, he sought victory. In death, he found immortality. The chronicles called him the Lionheart, not for his strength, but for his courage, the unflinching spirit that met every challenge without fear. Centuries later, his name still stands as the measure of bravery. His story reminds us that kings may fall, but legends do not. Richard's final breath was not an end. It was a passage from man to myth, from king to symbol. The Lionheart sleeps, but his echo remains, carried on by every tale of valor, every act of mercy, and every heart that still believes courage is stronger than fate. For in the end, it was not the arrow that killed him. It was destiny itself, a reminder that even lions must bow to time. But the roar of Richard the Lionheart still resounds, not in the halls of power, but in the stories that refuse to die. In the fading light of the ancient world, when empires rose and fell like tides, one woman ruled not by brute force, but by brilliance. Her name was Cleopatra, last queen of Egypt, last daughter of the Ptolemies, and the final flame of a dying empire. To some she was a seductress, to others a strategist, but to history she became the very embodiment of power, intellect, and tragedy. Cleopatra was born into a dynasty already fractured by greed and betrayal. Yet she was no ordinary monarch. Fluent in multiple languages, educated in philosophy, mathematics, and politics, she ruled with both mind and magnetism. When Rome's influence began to shadow the Nile, Cleopatra understood that survival meant alliance, and she found it in Julius Caesar. Their union was not simply passion, but diplomacy. Together, they restored her throne and Egypt's fleeting independence. But Caesar's assassination in Rome shattered that fragile order. In the chaos that followed, Cleopatra aligned herself with another Roman titan, Mark Antony. Their love became the scandal of the age, a union of East and West that defied politics and decency alike. Together, they sought to carve a new world, one ruled from Alexandria instead of Rome. But the Senate and Octavian Caesar's heir saw it as treason. The war that followed was as much about ideals as it was about power. At Actium, their fleets clashed in a storm of fire and smoke. Outmaneuvered and outnumbered, Antony's forces broke. Cleopatra's flagship turned and fled. The queen who had once commanded kings now watched her world unravel. Back in Egypt, the lovers retreated to Alexandria, where betrayal closed in from every side. When Octavian's armies entered the city, Antony, believing Cleopatra dead, fell on his own sword. Dying, he was carried to her chambers, his blood staining her gown as she wept. For the first time, the Queen of Egypt was powerless. Octavian offered her mercy, but mercy in Rome was a stage. He wanted her paraded through the streets, chained before the crowd, a living trophy of his triumph. Cleopatra would not allow it. On August 12, 30 BCC, she dressed in royal space, placed a crown upon her head, and sat upon her golden throne for the last time. Beside her lay a small basket, and within it an aspiu, the sacred cobra of Egypt. As the serpent struck, its venom coursing through her veins, Cleopatra met death as she had lived on her own terms. Her two handmaidens fell beside her, loyal even in the end. When Octavian found her body, he was struck not by victory, but by awe. She had denied him his spectacle. Her death was silent, regal, and absolute, a final act of defiance from a queen who would not be humiliated. With her passing, 3,000 years of Egyptian monarchy came to an end. The age of the pharaohs was over. Yet Cleopatra's story did not fade into must. Poets would write of her beauty. Historians would argue her genius. Painters would immortalize her in gold and shadow. She became a paradox, both sinner and saint, victim and victor. Through death, she achieved what she could not in immortality. The Romans took her emperor, but not her legend. For centuries, her name has stood as a symbol of power reclaimed, of dignity preserved, of the choice to meet destiny unmoved. She proved that true sovereignty is not granted by crown or empire, but by the courage to decide one's own end. Cleopatra's life was ember, her death, eternity. And as the sand of time buried her kingdom, her spirit remained whispering through the deserts of Egypt that even in defeat, there is majesty, and in surrender, there can be victory. For the last queen of the Nile did not fall. She ascended by her own will, by her own hand, into legend. He was not born to follow. From the moment Alexander of Macedon took his first breath, destiny followed close behind. Tutored by Aristotle, inspired by Achilles, and driven by an unyielding hunger for greatness, he would go on to conquer the known world before his 33rd birthday. Yet the same flame that illuminated his path would one day consume him. At 20, Alexander inherited his father's throne and his unfinished dream. Within a decade, he had crushed the Persian empires, marched across Asia, and declared himself master of the East and West. His armies called him invincible. The world called him divine. He named cities after himself, legends after his deeds. From the deserts of Egypt to the mountains of India, no fortress could stand before him. But victory, as always, has its cost. As his empire expanded, so did his isolation. The boy king became the god king, surrounded by flatterers and fear. The friends who once shared his laughter now whispered behind his back. He began to see betrayal in every glance. The man who once inspired loyalty began to command obedience. The line between mortal and immortal blurred, and Alexander crossed it willingly. In Babylon, in the summer of 323 BCC, he celebrated another victory. The palace glittered with gold and wine. Music filled the air. Yet beneath the revelry lay exhaustion. His body was worn by years of war, his mind by paranoia. During a banquet, after drinking deeply, he collapsed with fever. For days he lay in agony, unable to move, unable to speak. The physicians were powerless. The generals gathered in silence, waiting for their god to rise again. But Alexander did not rise. The conqueror of emperors was now conquered by something unfun, perhaps poison, perhaps illness, perhaps destiny itself. As his body weakened, his eyes burned with the same fierce clarity that had led him across continents. When asked to whom he would leave his vast empire, he whispered two words that would echo for centuries. To the strongest. Those words were both prophecy and curse. When he died, his empire fractured instantly. His generals tore it apart, carving kingdoms from the corpse of his dream. For all his brilliance, Alexander had built an empire too vast for any man to hold, even himself. His body was placed in a golden sarcophagus and carried to Egypt, where it lay for centuries, worshipped as that of a god. But his tomb, like his empire, was lost to time. No one knows where Alexander rests, only that his spirit has never slept. Alexander's death marked the end of an age and the birth of legend. His armies wept. His enemies mourned. Even history paused, unsure how to speak of a man who had become larger than it. In less than 13 years, he changed the map of the world. In death, he changed the idea of what it meant to be human. For Alexander the Great was not destroyed by an army or a sword, but by his own impossible ambition. He sought immortality, and in a way, he found it not through temples or crowns, but through memory. His name became the measure of greatness itself. Centuries later, kings would call themselves the new Alexander. Conquerors would trace his path, chasing a ghost they could never catch, but none would match his fire. For he was not merely a man of war, but a force of will, proof that greatness demands everything, even life itself. And so, the boy from Macedon, who dreamed of eternity, achieved it. His empire turned to dust, his cities crumbled, but his name remained. Alexander the Great, the man who lived as a god and died as a legend. The man who proved that immortality is not granted by the heavens, but earned by those who dare to reach for it. In the turbulent age between Alexander and Rome, when kingdoms rose and vanished in a single generation, one name burned briefly but brilliantly: Pyrrhus of Epirus. He was a warrior king, a tactician of genius, and a man who believed destiny bent to the will of the strong. To his followers, he was the heir to Alexander's greatness. To history, he would become the lesson of ambition without limit. Pyrrhus was born into chaos. His kingdom, Epirus, was small but fierce, perched on the edge of Greece, a land of mountains and warriors. From childhood, he was trained for conquest, dreaming of empires beyond the horizon. Charismatic, daring, and reckless, he fought not for survival, but for glory. And when the chance came to challenge Rome, the rising power of the West, Pyrrhus seized it with both hands. In 280 BCC, at the Battle of Heraclea, his army faced the Romans for the first time. The clash was thunderous. Pyrrhus unleashed his secret weapon, war elephants, giants of battle unseen by Roman eyes. The Roman lines broke in terror, their formation shattered under hooves and tusks. Pyrrhus claimed victory, his banners shining beneath the Italian sea. Yet even as his men celebrated, his advisors counted the cost. Thousands of his finest soldiers lay dead. 2 years later, he fought again at Esculum. Once more, the Romans were driven from the field. Once more, the ground was covered in the bodies of the fallen. When his officers congratulated him, Pyrrhus gave a weary smile and said words that would echo for eternity. "Another such victory, and I am undone." That single sentence became his legacy, the Pyrrhic victory, a triumph so costly it becomes indistinguishable from defeat. Pyrrhus had beaten Rome in battle, but Rome, with its endless legions and unshakable resolve, could not be destroyed by one man. Slowly, the tide turned. His army bled, his allies wavered, and his dream of emperor began to fade. He turned his gaze to Sicily, hoping to carve new dominion there. But fate had other plans. Betrayal and exhaustion followed him wherever he marched. By 272 BCC, the once great conqueror had returned to Greece, fighting smaller wars that could not fill the void of his lost ambition. And then, in a narrow street of Argos, destiny struck. During a chaotic battle, Pyrrhus chased an enemy soldier into the twisting alleys. From above, an old woman watching from her balcony hurled a roof tile down upon his head. It struck him hard, knocking him to the ground. Before he could rise, a soldier ended his life with a sword. The king who had faced Rome itself fell not to legions or generals, but to chance to a moment of absurd cruel fight. His men found his body in a disbelief. The conqueror who once defied empires was gone, slain by a falling brick. Historians would later call it poetic justice, the perfect irony for a man who believed himself greater than destiny. Pyrrhus had sought eternal glory, but what he earned was a warning that pride and ambition can build empires only to watch them crumble beneath the weight of their own costly. Yet, even in failure, Pyrrhus's story endures. His name lives wherever men measure the price of victory, a reminder that success without wisdom is its own destruction. Rome would remember him, not as a vanquished foe, but as a mirror of what they could become: unstoppable, yet never cease fight. In the end, Pyrrhus proved that even a king who wins every battle can still lose everything. His victories were grand, his defeats invisible, but the toll of both was the same. He conquered cities, toppled armies, and chased the shadow of Alexander, only to find that the greatest enemy of all was not Rome, not time, but the hunger that no triumph could fill. And so he died as he lived, fighting, reaching for immortality, undone by his own hand. Pyrrhus of Epirus, the man who won himself to death, the king whose victories destroyed him. He was born on a small island, and yet his name would one day shake the world. Napoleon Bonaparte, soldier, emperor, visionary, tyrant. To some he was the savior of France, to others the destroyer of Europe. But beyond the myth and the legend stood a man who climbed to the highest peak of power, only to fall into a silence deeper than any battlefield. From his earliest days, Napoleon was different. Restless, brilliant, and consumed by the desire to rise above his station. He saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. The French Revolution gave him a chance. Amid the chaos, he rose through the ranks with a speed that defied logic. Victory followed him like a shadow: Toulon, Italy, Egypt, each campaign adding to his legend. At 30, he crowned himself emperor, placing the laurel on his own head, as if to declare that destiny itself had chosen him. Under his rule, France transformed. Laws were rewritten, roads carved through nations, ideas of liberty and empire intertwined. But his genius was inseparable from his pride. He could never stop conquering. Spain burned, Austria bled, Prussia fell. And then came Russia, vast, cold, unyielding. In 1812, he marched 600,000 men across the frontier, the greatest army the world had ever seen. When he returned, only a fraction remained. Snow and starvation had done what no general could. From that moment, the tide turned. Europe united against him. At Leipzig, at Waterloo, his star began to dim. Still, Napoleon refused surrender. He believed he could shape fate as he had shaped nations. But fate had grown tired of him. Defeated at Waterloo in 1815, the man who once ruled an empire was exiled to a barren rock in the Atlantic, the island of St. Helena. There, surrounded by the endless sea, the emperor became a prisoner. His palace was a small, damp house. His court, a handful of loyal men, and the ghosts of his victories. The roar of cannons was replaced by the whisper of waves. He walked the cliffs alone, staring into the horizon, perhaps still plotting, still dreaming. The world had shrunk to a prison of his own memories. Yet even in exile, Napoleon's mind burned. He dictated his memoirs, crafting his legacy with the same precision he once used on the battlefield. He recast himself not as a tyrant, but as a martyr of destiny, the man who dared to change the world and was punished for it. And perhaps, in a sense, he was right. As years passed, illness began to claim him. The fire that once commanded millions now flickered in the dim light of his island chamber. On May 5, 1821, Napoleon whispered his final words. France, the army. Josephine. Then he was gone. The emperor who had crowned himself died alone, far from his homeland, far from glory, and when news of his death reached Europe, even his enemies paused. For all his ambition, all his wars, there was no denying his greatness. He had redrawn the map of Europe, changed the art of war, and left behind a name that would never fade. 2 decades later, France brought his body home. Millions lined the streets of Paris as his coffin passed beneath the Arc de Triomphe, the monument he had built for his victories. He returned in death to the city that had made him immortal. Napoleon Bonaparte was more than a conqueror. He was the embodiment of human ambition, brilliant, flawed, relentless. His rise proved the power of will. His fall revealed the price of it. He once said, "Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever." And in that, he was right. For even in defeat, even in exile, even in désuet, the emperor of the French refused obscurity. He had lost his empire, but not his legend. And as the waves of St. Helena crash against the shore, they still seem to echo his story, that greatness is not measured by victory, but by the courage to dream beyond all reason and to pay the cost when those dreams come to an end. He was called Le Brave des Braves, the bravest of the brave. Michel Ney, Marshal of France, was not born into nobility, but into fire. A commoner who rose through courage alone, he became one of Napoleon's greatest generals, a man whose valor inspired soldiers and whose loyalty defied kings. His life was bound to the rise and fall of an emperor, and his death would mark the final chapter of the age of Napoleon. Born in 1769 in the town of Sarre-Louis, Ney grew up in a world about to be consumed by revolution. When France erupted in flames, he joined the army as a simple cavalryman. Through skill, fearlessness, and sheer will, he reached from the ranks, earning command after command. His men worshipped him, not because of his title, but because he fought where they fought, always in front, never behind. On the battlefield, Ney was a storm made flesh. He led charges that broke enemy lines, faced cannon fire with calm, and turned chaos into legend. At Austerlitz, at Jena, at Borodino, his name was shouted as both rallying cry and prayer. Napoleon trusted him completely, calling him the embodiment of courage. But courage, as Ney would learn, cannot shield a man from fate. In 1812, during the disastrous retreat from Russia, Ney commanded the rearguard, the final defense of the dying Grande Armée. Temperatures plunged below zero. Men starved, froze, and fell in silence. Ney refused to leave them. He fought every step back across the frozen wasteland, holding the line against impossible odds. When he finally staggered into friendly territory, frostbitten and half dead, Napoleon embraced him and said, "You are the bravest of the brave." But the empire they had built was crumbling. After Napoleon's first abdication, Ney swore allegiance to the restored Bourbon monarchy, believing peace had returned to France. Yet when Napoleon escaped from Elba and marched once more toward Paris, Ney's heart betrayed his oath. Sent to stop his former emperor, he confronted Napoleon face to face. The soldiers around him waited, rifles trembling. Napoleon opened his coat and cried, "If any of you will shoot your emperor, here I am." Ney could not resist. He turned to his men and shouted, "Long live the emperor!" That moment sealed his fate. After Waterloo, when the dream of the empire finally died, Ney was captured by royalist forces and charged with treason. His trial was swift, his sentence predetermined. On December 7, 1815, he was taken to the Luxembourg Gardens in Paris to face a firing squad. Offered a blindfold, he refused. He stood tall, proud as ever, his eyes blazing with defiance. "Soldiers," he said, "aim straight at my heart." Then, with the same authority he once used to command thousands, he gave his final order. "Fire!" The shots rang out. The bravest of the brave fell, his blood soaking the cold winter ground. France buried him, but could not bury his legend. To some, he was a traitor. To others, a martyr of loyalty. Even his enemies admitted his greatness. He had lived by courage and died by conviction. A soldier to the last. In the years that followed, stories spread that he had survived, escaped to America, and lived in secret. Perhaps people simply refused to accept that such a man could die. But whether alive or dead, Ney had achieved what few ever could: immortality through honor. Michel Ney's life was a mirror of the empire he served, brilliant, flawed, and doomed by its own glory. He proved that courage does not belong to kings, nor to conquerors, but to those who stand their ground when the world itself turns against them. He faced death as he faced every battle, unflinching, unafraid, and defiant. The bravest of the brave did not fall that day. He ascended into legend, into memory, into the eternal ranks of those who lived and died for something greater than themselves. He was the warrior king of the North, fearless, brilliant, and born for battle. Charles XII of Sweden ascended the throne at 15, inheriting an empire that stretched across Scandinavia and beyond. His enemies saw a boy. What they found was a storm. In less than a decade, he turned Sweden into one of Europe's most formidable powers. Yet the same fire that lifted him to greatness would lead him into darkness, and his death would mark the end of Sweden's golden age. Charles was no ordinary monarch. He rejected luxury, despised comfort, and lived for war. He slept in his uniform, rode at the front of every charge, and fought alongside his men as an equal. They loved him for his courage and feared his obsession with victory. At the start of the Great Northern War in 1700, three nations, Russia, Denmark, and Poland, united to crush the young king before he could grow dangerous. Instead, he crushed them. At Narva, facing an army nearly 4 times his size, Charles led a daring assault through a blizzard. The snow blinded the enemy, and the Swedes slaughtered them in chaos. Victory after victory followed. Europe watched in awe as the boy king became legend. But with each triumph, his ambition grew. He believed himself invincible, destined to rule through sheer will. And like all men who believe in destiny, he stopped listening to reason. In 1708, Charles made his fatal mistake. He invaded Russia, a campaign that would echo Napoleon's disaster a century later. The march was brutal. The winter came early. Disease and hunger devoured his army. At Poltava, the Russians under Peter the Great struck back. Charles fought bravely, even after being wounded, but his army was annihilated. He fled to the Ottoman Empire, still dreaming of revenge. Years passed in exile. When he finally returned to Sweden, the empire he had built was collapsing. His enemies pressed from every border. His people starved. His allies deserted him. Still, Charles refused peace. He believed that glory could be reclaimed through one final campaign. In 1718, during the siege of the Norwegian fortress of Fredrikstad, the warrior king once again stood at the front lines. The night was cold and silent. Charles leaned over the trench to inspect the enemy fortifications. A single shot cracked through the darkness. The bullet entered one temple and exited the other. He fell instantly. His officers rushed to him, but the king was already gone. His body remained upright, as if frozen in command. No one knows who fired the shot. Some said it came from the enemy fortress. Others whispered it was an assassin's bullet from within his own camp. The truth was buried with him. But the effect was undeniable. With his death, the Swedish Empire crumbled. The dream of northern dominance died in the snow with its warrior king. When his soldiers found him, they did not weep. They stood in silence, saluting the man who had never asked of them anything he would not do himself. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as though he had finally found the rest he never sought in life. Charles VI's death was more than the end of a man. It was the end of an era, the last breath of a nation that once believed courage alone could conquer the world. His life remains a paradox. A king who feared nothing but defeat, and a ruler who won every battle until his wars destroyed him. Today his name lingers like the northern wind, cold, proud, unyielding. The boy who became a god of war fell not in retreat, but in defiance, staring toward the battlefield he could never leave behind. And in that single moment, when the bullet struck, a kingdom fell, but a legend was born. For Charles XII of Sweden did not die as a king. He died as he had lived a soldier. He was a soldier's soldier, fearless, brilliant, and undefeated. Across 60 battles, Alexander Suvorov never knew defeat. He was Russia's greatest commander, a master of movement and discipline, a man whose strategies shaped empires. Yet his death came not from war, but from betrayal, not on the battlefield, but in the quiet decay of exile. The general, who had once shaken Europe, died in silence, a victim, not of his enemies, but of his own emperor. Born in 1729 to a family of modest nobility, Suvorov was frail and sickly as a child. Few believed he would live long, much less become a warrior. But within that thin frame burned an iron will. He studied tactics obsessively, trained relentlessly, and joined the army at 17. Through talent and relentless drive, he rose through the ranks, commanding men who would follow him anywhere. His philosophy was simple: speed, surprise, and street. He taught his soldiers to move fast, strike hard, and think for themselves. Perish yourself, he told them, but save your comrades. His armies marched where others crawled, fought in conditions where others froze, and triumphed where others surrendered. Against Turks, Poles, and Italians, Suvorov's genius turned battlefields into theaters of victory. During the late 18th century, when Europe was convulsed by revolution and war, Suvorov became Russia's sword. He crushed uprisings in Poland, liberated Italy from French forces, and led campaigns across the Alps that defied imagination. His men adored him, calling him the father of the army. Even his enemies respected him. Napoleon himself, upon hearing of Suvorov's victories, is said to have murmured, "He is a great man." But greatness often breeds envy. At the height of his fame, Suvorov fell out of favor with Tsar Paul I. The young emperor, paranoid and jealous of the old general's glory, stripped him of his command, his titles, and his dignity. The man who had carried Russia to triumph was banished to his estate like a criminal. There, surrounded by memories of war and the silence of the countryside, his health began to fail. Some said it was illness. Others whispered it was heartbreak. In 1800, Alexander Suvorov died quietly in St. Petersburg, far from the sound of drums and cannon. When his soldiers heard the news, they wept openly. At his funeral, they cried out, "The father of the army is dead." His grave bore only 5 words: "Here lies Suvorov." No golden epitaph, no imperial tribute, just the truth, stripped bare and eternal. His passing marked more than the death of a man. It was the end of an ideal, the belief that honor and service could exist without politics. The Tsar who had exiled him would soon regret it, realizing too late that he had silenced the very man who had made Russia strong. In the years that followed, Suvorov's legend only grew. His tactics became textbooks. His principles became scripture for generations of soldiers. And his humility, rare among conquerors, became his crown. He had lived for duty, fought for country, and died for neither, betrayed by the empire he had built. Alexander Suvorov's life remains a paradox. A man who mastered war, yet sought peace, who commanded thousands, but desired nothing for himself. In an age of vanity and power, he stood apart, a reminder that true greatness asks for no reward. He never lost a battle, yet in the end, he was defeated not by any army, but by pride, jealousy, and the cruelty of kings. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Because in the silence of his death, there was a purity no victory could ever match. Even now, his name is spoken with reverence in the ranks of soldiers who understand that discipline without compassion is tyranny, and courage without humility is hollow. Suvorov taught them both. He died in silence, but his legacy roars still, a general, a teacher, and a man who proved that glory fades, but honor endures. In the dark years of the Second World War, when oceans became battlefields and the skies burned with fire, one man stood at the center of Japan's empire of war, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the strategist who believed that a single, decisive blow could cripple the United States before it could rise to its full power. He was brilliant, disciplined, and doomed. The man who awakened a giant would one day be destroyed by it. Born in 1884 to a samurai family, Yamamoto grew up steeped in duty and precision. He studied in America, learned its language, understood its people, and respected its industrial might. That respect became fear, and that fear, strategy. When war with the United States became inevitable, Yamamoto warned his superiors that Japan could fight for 6 months, maybe a year. But beyond that, defeat was certain. Still, when the decision was made, he obeyed. On December 7, 1941, his plan unfolded with perfect execution. Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor at dawn, sinking battleships, destroying airfields, and killing thousands. The attack shocked the world. Japan rejoiced, but Yamamoto, though victorious, was silent. He knew what he had done. "I fear," he said, "that all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." For the next 2 years, he led Japan's naval war across the Pacific, a campaign of daring and precision. Yet with each battle, the tide began to turn. At Midway, his fleet suffered a catastrophic defeat. The giant had awakened. America's industrial power and relentless will began to crush Japan's dreams of empire. Yamamoto, though weary, continued to serve with the same discipline that had defined his life. He remained the symbol of Japanese naval pride, respected even by his enemies. Then came April 18, 1943. The United States had broken Japan's secret codes. Through intercepted messages, American intelligence learned that Yamamoto would be inspecting bases in the Solomon Islands. Operation Vengeance was born. A squadron of P-38 Lightning fighters took off from Guadalcanal, flying hundreds of miles over the ocean to intercept his plane. The mission was dangerous, almost impossible, but so was the man they were sent to kill. At 9:35 a.m., over the jungle of Bougainville, the American pilots spotted a formation of Japanese bombers. They dived from the clouds, guns blazing. Yamamoto's aircraft was riddled with bullets, engines smoking. Witnesses said it banked sharply, clipped the trees, and disappeared into the green canopy. When Japanese search teams found the wreckage hours later, they discovered his body still seated upright, hand gloved in white, clutching his ceremonial sword. He had died instantly. The empire mourned in silence. The man who had guided Japan's destiny was gone, brought down not by failure, but by fear. His death was kept secret for weeks to preserve morale, and when it was finally announced, he was hailed as a hero. Even his enemies treated his end with respect. In America, there was no triumph in his death, only the cold satisfaction of justice delivered. Yamamoto's fall was more than the loss of a commander. It was the breaking of Japan's spirit. Without him, the empire drifted deeper into desperation, fighting a war it could no longer win. The strategist who had begun the Pacific conflict became its symbol of inevitability, the reminder that every act of aggression carries the seed of its own destruction. In the end, Yamamoto's prophecy proved true. The giant he had feared awoke and crushed everything he had built. Yet history remembers him not as a villain, but as a man of tragic clarity, one who foresaw disaster and walked into it with open eyes. On the jungle floor of Bougainville, among the wreckage and silence, his story ended as it began with duty. The admiral who had unleashed war met death with calm, his honor intact. His death was vengeance from the skies, a poetic end to the man who once ruled them. And as the years passed, the world saw in Yamamoto's fate a truth as old as war itself, that genius without peace becomes ruin, and that the architects of destruction are always the first to fall beneath their own design. He was the desert fox, swift, cunning, and honorable. Erwin Rommel, the most brilliant commander of Nazi Germany, fought with a code of chivalry rare in an age of brutality. To his men, he was a legend. To his enemies, a worthy foe. To Hitler, a problem. His genius on the battlefield won him glory, but his conscience would cost him everything. Rommel was born in 1891 in southern Germany, the son of a schoolteacher. He dreamed first of engineering, not war. But the Great War changed everything. As a young officer, he displayed courage that bordered on madness, leading from the front, surviving wounds that would have killed lesser men. His soldiers followed him not out of fear, but devotion. Even then, he understood what true leadership meant: to share danger, to earn respect, to fight cleanly. When the Second World War erupted, Rommel rose quickly. His tactics were revolutionary, fluid, unpredictable, and fast. In 1941, he was sent to North Africa to lead the Africa Corps, and there, in the endless sands, he became immortal. His maneuvers confused and humiliated the British forces time and again. He struck like lightning, earning his famous nickname, the Desert Fox. Reporters, even from the enemy, admired his brilliance. Winston Churchill himself called him a great general. But Rommel's victories could not hide his growing doubts. He was no politician. He served his country, not the ideology that poisoned it. He refused to execute prisoners, treated captured soldiers with respect, and despised the atrocities committed by the SS. His loyalty to Germany did not extend to Hitler. As the war turned against the Reich, Rommel saw what others would not: that the Führer was leading Germany to ruin. In 1944, a group of high-ranking officers plotted to assassinate Hitler. The July 20th plot failed, but its shockwaves spread across the empire. Rommel's name appeared among the suspected conspirators. Whether he was truly involved remains uncertain, but in the twisted logic of the regime, suspicion was enough. Hitler now faced a dilemma. Rommel was beloved by the German people, adored by his soldiers, and admired even abroad. To execute him publicly would destroy morale. To let him live would seem weak. So the dictator offered him a choice. On October 14, 1944, two officers arrived at Rommel's home in Herrlingen. They brought with them a message: take poison and spare your family, or face a public trial that would doom them all. Rommel, calm as ever, understood. He said goodbye to his wife and son, then stepped into the car waiting outside. Minutes later, he bit into a cyanide capsule. The man who had once commanded armies died quietly in the back seat. The Nazis announced that Rommel had died of war wounds. He was given a full state funeral, his coffin draped in the flag of the Reich, his name praised by the same men who had ordered his death. But history saw through the lie. It saw the truth of a soldier trapped in a war of lies and fanaticism, a man of honor crushed by the very regime he served. Rommel's death was more than a tragedy. It was a symbol. It marked the moment when decency itself became treason, when the courage to question was punished more harshly than failure. In his final act, he chose dignity over obedience, truth over survival. After the war, his reputation endured. The allies who once fought him now honored him. His enemies laid wreaths at his grave. Even those who despised the Nazi regime spoke his name with respect. The Desert Fox became something greater than a general. He became a reminder that honor can survive, even in the darkest times. Erwin Rommel lived as a warrior and died as a man of conscience. His battles are long over, but his story still whispers through the desert winds. He once commanded a story of loyalty, courage, and the impossible choices of men trapped between duty and morality. In the end, the Desert Fox was hunted not by his enemies, but by his own. And yet, he won the one battle that mattered most, the battle to remain human in a world that had forgotten what that meant. In the summer of 1876, on the windswept plains of Montana, one of the most legendary and disastrous last stands in American history unfolded. The man at its center was George Armstrong Custer, a hero to some, a fool to others, and a name forever tied to both glory and ruin. His fall at the Battle of the Little Bighorn became more than a defeat. It became a myth the moment arrogance met destiny. Custer was born for war. A graduate of West Point, he barely passed his classes but thrived in chaos. During the Civil War, his reckless courage turned him into one of the Union's youngest generals. He charged first, asked questions later, and somehow always survived. His golden hair, sharp uniform, and flair for drama made him a symbol of American daring. The newspapers loved him. The soldiers followed him. And he believed, with unshakable certainty, that fate itself rode beside him. But peace was a harder battle than war. When the guns of the Civil War fell silent, Custer sought new glory in the westward expansion, a campaign that would pit him against the native tribes of the Great Plains. He saw the frontier not as a place of people, but of conquest. And in that blindness lay his undoing. By 1870, tensions between the United States and the Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho nations had reached a breaking point. The U.S. government wanted their lands, rich with beef. The tribes wanted freedom. Custer, commanding the 7th Cavalry, was sent to enforce the government's will. He expected a skirmish. What awaited him was an army. Near the Little Bighorn River, Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse had united thousands of warriors, one of the largest native coalitions ever seen. Custer, ignoring warnings and intelligence, divided his force of 600 men into solitary detachments. He believed surprise and speed would bring victory. Instead, it brought disaster. On June 25th, Custer's column crested the hills and found not a small camp, but a sea of tipis stretching across the valley. The sound of drums and war cries filled the air. Within minutes, his men were surrounded. The sky darkened with arrows. The gunfire was relentless. Outnumbered more than 5 to 1, the 7th Cavalry fought desperately. But the end was inevitable. Custer's last moments remain a mystery. Some say he fought until his pistols ran dry. Others that he fell early in the chaos. When the smoke cleared, over 200 of his men lay dead beside him. Their bodies were stripped and mutilated according to native war customs, a message to the invaders who had violated their land. Custer's corpse was found with 2 bullet wounds, one to the chest, one to the head. No one ever knew which came first or if the final shot was his own. The defeat shocked the United States. Newspapers called it a massacre, a national tragedy. The Army called it revenge. Within a year, the native tribes who had triumphed at Little Bighorn were crushed under overwhelming retaliation. Victory had brought them only glory. For Custer, death delivered the immortality he had always chased. He became a martyr of manifest destiny, a symbol used to justify the very conquest that had destroyed him. His legend was written not by truth, but by those who needed heroes. Over time, that legend began to crumble, revealing a man, not of destiny, but of hubris, a soldier whose overconfidence cost hundreds their lives. And yet, there remains something undeniably tragic about him. Custer lived for the charge, for the sound of gunfire, for the chance to carve his name into history. He found it at Little Bighorn, carved not in victory, but in defeat. His last stand endures because it speaks to something universal, the thin line between bravery and arrogance, between glory and destruction. Custer's story is not just about how he died, but why he fought. For pride, for immortality, for a dream that could never be fulfilled. On those grassy hills where the river winds quietly today, the echoes of that final battle still linger. The wind carries no judgment, only remembrance. And in that silence, George Armstrong Custer's legend lives on not as the hero he imagined, but as the man who proved that pride, no matter how shining, always pays its price. He was the embodiment of war, bold, brash, unstoppable. General George Smith Patton, the man who led tanks across Europe and fear into the hearts of enemies, believed he was born to fight. His name became synonymous with victory, his spirit with defiance. Yet for all his triumphs on the battlefield, Patton would meet his end, not in combat, but in a quiet German field, far from the sound of guns. Patton was born in 1885 into a family of soldiers. From childhood, he studied warfare as if it were a sacred art. He believed in destiny, in reincarnation, even claiming he had fought in ancient wars. To him, battle was not horror, but purpose, the test through which men proved their worth. At West Point, his intensity bordered on obsession. He demanded perfection from himself and from everyone around him. During World War II, that obsession found its stage. As commander of the U.S. Third Army, Patton became a force of nature. His armored divisions tore through Europe faster than any in history, crushing Nazi resistance from France to Germany. His speeches were raw, his language fierce, his belief in victory absolute. Soldiers feared him, loved him, followed him without hesitation. He was, as one officer said, a living weapon. But Patton's fire burned both ways. His temper and arrogance made him enemies as powerful as the ones he fought. He slapped a soldier suffering from shell shock, calling him a coward, an act that nearly ended his career. He defied orders, mocked allies, and spoke truths no one wanted to hear. To the press, he was unpredictable. To his superiors, dangerous. To himself, he was simply honest. When the war ended in 1945, Patton found himself trapped in a world without battles. Europe lay in ruins, victory secured. Yet he could not rest. The man who had conquered armies could not conquer peace. He warned of Soviet ambitions, criticized U.S. policy, and questioned the politics of occupation. His words, sharp as bullets, made him enemies once more, but this time they were on his own side. Then, in December 1945, fate struck. Traveling through the German countryside, Patton's Cadillac collided with an army truck. The impact threw him forward, snapping his neck. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down, a warrior imprisoned in his own body. For 12 days, he lay in a hospital bed, unable to thrive, his mind still fierce, though his body had failed him. To those who visited, he spoke with quiet acceptance. "It's hell," he said, "to be old and useless." On December 21, 1945, George S. Patton, the man who had survived every bullet, every explosion, every campaign, still lost the one battle he could not win. He was 60 years old. The world mourned him, though some whispered of conspiracy, of assassination, of secrets buried with him. No proof ever surfaced. Perhaps, as he once said, "All glory is fleeting." Patton was laid to rest among his soldiers in Luxembourg, not in Arlington, not in grandeur, but in the soil of the land he had freed. Rows of white crosses stretch around him, silent witnesses to his final command. Even in death, he remained among his men, as he had always promised. History remembers him as both hero and heretic, a man who lived by his own rules, fought with relentless purpose, and spoke with unfiltered truth. His greatness was carved from contradiction, discipline and chaos, faith and fury, genius and madness. He believed war was eternal, and in some way, he was right. For Patton's story is the story of the warrior spirit itself, brilliant, restless, and doomed to burn out rather than fade away. The general who survived war could not survive peace because peace offered no enemy worthy of his fire. And so his legend endures not in medals or parades, but in the hearts of those who still hear his voice echo through history, urging men to move forward, to fight harder, to never accept defeat. George S. Patton, the man who conquered war itself, only to be conquered by silence. High above the battlefields of World War I, where the sky itself became a killing ground, one name struck fear and awe across every front: Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. He was the most feared pilot of the Great War, the perfect hunter of the clouds. His crimson triplane was both beauty and terror, a streak of red death that ruled the heavens. But even legends cannot escape gravity, and the king of the sky would one day fall to earth. Born in 1892 to a Prussian noble family, Richthofen grew up with discipline carved into his veins. He was bred for the cavalry. But when the war transformed the world, so too did it transform him. Horses gave way to machines, sabers to engines, and Richthofen took to the skies. What began as curiosity became obsession. In the air, he found freedom and purpose. Under the mentorship of the great Xwald Bolke, Richthofen learned not just how to fly, but how to hunt. He studied his prey, attacked from the sun, and never wasted a bullet. Unlike many aces who chased glory, he pursued precision. Each victory was a calculation, each kill a mark of mastery. By 1917, he had shot down more than 80 enemy aircraft, an unmatched record that made him both hero and target. The Allied pilots gave him his name, the Red Baron. But behind the fame was a man, burdened by it. The war had turned into slaughter, and the boy who once thrilled at flight grew weary of death. Still, he continued to fly, bound by duty and the unspoken code of the fighter pilot to meet one's enemy face to face. He refused to lead from the ground. He could not stand the thought of dying in bed while others fought above him. On April 21, 1918, the Red Baron took off from his base in northern France. He was chasing a Canadian biplane over the Somme River when fate found him. In the heat of pursuit, he crossed into enemy territory, flying low over the trenches. Ground fire erupted from below, a storm of bullets tearing through the air. One shot found its mark, piercing his chest. The Red Baron's hands tightened on the controls. His crimson triplane wavered, descended, and touched the earth for the last time. Australian troops reached the wreckage first. They found Richthofen still seated, eyes open, his face calm. as though he had simply landed from a long flight. There was no fear, no struggle, only stillness. The man who had ruled the sky died as he had lived, in the cockpit, among the clouds and chaos. In an extraordinary gesture of respect, the Allied soldiers who had once hunted him buried him with full military honors. They placed wreaths on his grave with the inscription, "To our gallant and worthy foe." His enemies saluted him, not as a killer, but as a knight, a relic of an older, nobler form of war already vanishing in the mechanical slaughter of the 20th century. The death of the Red Baron marked the end of chivalry in the sky. The age of honor gave way to the age of machines. Yet his legend endured. His red triplane became a symbol not just of war, but of courage, the courage to fight face to face, to live by skill and die by chance. Manfred von Richthofen was only 25 years old, but in those few years he had transcended mortality. His name became myth, his color became icon. Every pilot who has taken to the air since flies in the shadow of the Red Baron. He proved that, even in war's cold machinery, there remains a place for grace, precision, and humanity. And as long as the ski holds the sound of engines and wind, the echo of his wings will remain the whisper of a legend who fell not in disgrace but in perfect stillness, as if the heavens themselves had called him home. He was the scourge of God, the man whose name made emperors tremble. To the Romans, he was terror, made flesh. To his people, he was destiny itself. Attila the Hun, the ruler of the steppes, had united the tribes of Central Asia and forged a force so fierce that even the mighty walls of Constantinople quaked at his approach. His armies burned cities, broke kingdoms, and reshaped the map of Europe. And yet, in the end, the conqueror who defied empires was undone not by battle, but by a whisper of fate and a single night of celebration. Born around 460 AD, Attila rose from the plains of the Danube, where the wind carried both freedom and fear. He was not born to rule. He seized power through cunning, charisma, and absolute will. Under his command, the Huns became the storm that devoured the West. He crushed Roman legions, ravaged Gaul, and made emperors pay him tribute in gold just to keep their cities standing. He was feared not for cruelty alone, but for the terrible logic of his ambition. To him, conquest was order. Submission was peace. In battle, Attila was relentless. He rode at the head of his horsemen, his sword said to have been forged by the gods themselves. Wherever he went, civilizations fell silent. Yet for all his savagery, he was also a man of vision. He dreamed not merely of destruction, but of empress one that would unite the world beneath his banner. By 453 AD, it seemed he had achieved it. The Romans were broken, the Goths scattered, and the Huns stood unchallenged. Then came the wedding. In his later years, Attila decided to take another wife, a young woman named Ildiko, whose beauty was said to rival the dawn. The marriage was to seal a new alliance, a gesture of peace in a life defined by war. On the night of the feast, the great hall of his palace was filled with music, laughter, and the scent of wine. Attila drank deeply, celebrating the empire he had built and the life he believed would never end. But when morning came, the laughter was gone. The guards entered the chamber and found their king lying motionless on the bed. His new bride sat beside him, weeping in silence. Blood stained the sheets, not from a wound of battle, but from within. The conqueror of nations was dead. The cause remains a mystery. Some said he had heard a sudden nosebleed, choking in his sleep. Others whispered of betrayal, that Ildiko, forced into marriage, had taken vengeance. The chroniclers of Rome called it divine justice, the hand of God striking down the scourge of mankind. Whatever the truth, the effect was the same. The empire of the Huns, held together by his will alone, unraveled within months. His sons fought over the remnants, and the storm he had unleashed he feasted into dust. Attila's death was as shocking as it was symbolic. A man who had lived by the sword perished without one drawn. His end proved that even the greatest conquerors are still mortal, bound not by the power they wield, but by the frailty of the flesh. The man who had made the world kneel was felled by a moment of stillness. They buried him in secret, somewhere along the Danube, encased in coffins of iron, silver, and gold. The slaves who dug his grave were killed to keep its location hidden. No one has ever found it. Like his empire, it vanished into legend. To this day, the story of Attila the Hun endures not just for the terror he brought, but for the irony of his fall. He had conquered cities, kingdoms, and armies, but not fully. In a single night, the wedding feast of a king became the funeral of a world. Attila's name still rides on the wind of history, fierce, unfought, eternal. He reminds us that power, no matter how absolute, cannot outrun destiny. For even the scourge of God must one day answer to something greater. He sailed from a world of kings and kingdoms into a land of gods and gold. Hernán Cortés, the man who toppled the Aztec Empire, was once hailed as the greatest conqueror Spain had ever known. His ambition reshaped continents, his victories redrew maps, and his name became legend. But history has a way of turning glory into judgment. The man who conquered a world would die consumed by the very weight of what he had done. Born in 1485 in Medellin, Spain, Cortés was restless from the start, intelligent, daring, and dangerously ambitious. He dreamed of adventure, not obedience. In an age when oceans were the frontiers of empire, he crossed the Atlantic to seek his fortune in the New World. There, in the colonies of the Caribbean, he proved his worth as both soldier and schemer. Yet even as he rose in power, he craved more. He wanted an empire of his own. In 1519, he set sail for the mainland of Mexico with a few hundred men, defying orders from his superiors. What he found would change history forever: the Aztec civilization, the richest and most powerful in the Americas. Its capital, Tenochtitlan, was a city of dazzling temples, canals, and markets, rivaling any in Europe. To the Spaniards, it was a vision of both beauty and blasphemy. To Cortés, it was destiny. Through diplomacy, deception, and divine coincidence, Cortés entered the city as both guest and threat. The Aztec emperor, Montezuma II, believed the Spaniard might be the god Quetzalcoatl, returned from the sea. Cortés played the role well. But faith soon turned to fear. When the inevitable rebellion erupted, the city became a nightmare of fire and steel. The conquistadors, armed with muskets and greed, slaughtered thousands. Montezuma was killed by his own people, or by the Spaniards, no one knows. The empire of the Aztecs crumbled beneath its own blood. Cortés returned to Spain a hero. He was granted titles, estates, and riches beyond imagining. But beneath the surface, shadows began to grow. The court turned cold. The king grew wary of his fame. The church whispered of heresy and sin. The glory that had once crowned him now began to suffocate him. He had conquered an empire, but in doing so, he had destroyed a civilization. As years passed, Cortés became an outcast in his own homeland. He petitioned the crown for recognition, but his letters went unanswered. He lived surrounded by luxury, yet haunted by ghosts, the screams of the Aztecs, the face of Montezuma, the burning temples of Tenochtitlan. Friends wrote that he seemed restless, pacing the halls of his estates, muttering to himself. He who had once commanded thousands now wandered through silence. In 1503, Hernán Cortés died near Seville, and largely forgotten. No grand procession marked his passing. No emperor honored his memory. The man who had given Spain a continent died as an afterthought. He left behind wealth beyond counting and guilt beyond measure. Centuries later, his story remains one of the most haunting in history. He was both creator and destroyer, a man who believed himself chosen by God, but acted as if he were one. His conquest gave birth to a new world and buried an old one forever. Cortes once said that fortune favors the bold. Perhaps it did, but it also curses them. For in his triumph, he lost everything that makes triumph worth having: peace, redemption, and rest. His empire outlived him, but his soul never escaped the ruins he built. The conqueror who crossed oceans found that no sea could wash away blood. And so his name endures, not as a hero, nor as a villain, but as a warning that the pursuit of glory without conscience turns even the mightiest into ghosts. In the end, Hernán Cortés conquered everything but himself, and that, history would decide, was the greatest conquest of all and the most tragic. He was called the Tsar Liberator, a ruler who tried to drag a frozen empire into the light. Alexander II of Russia, born to absolute power, sought not conquest but reform. In a world built on oppression, he dared to believe in change, and for that, he would pay the ultimate price. His death would become a symbol of both progress and tragedy, a man killed by the very freedom he tried to give. Born in 1818, the eldest son of Tsar Nicholas I, Alexander was raised in an age of iron. Russia was vast, mighty, and unyielding, ruled through fear and tradition. From a young age, he was taught discipline, duty, and the divine right of kings. Yet beneath the armor of his upbringing, there was a quiet intelligence, a curiosity about the world beyond the palace walls. He traveled Europe, studied its governments, and saw what his own empire lacked: liberty, industry, and hope. When he ascended the throne in 1855, Russia was reeling from defeat in the Crimean War. The empire's might had been exposed as illusion, its people impoverished, its army broken. Alexander understood that survival required transformation. He began a series of reforms that would make him one of the most remarkable rulers in Russian history. In 1861, he issued his boldest decree, the emancipation of the serfs. Overnight, more than 20 million peasants were freed from bondage, their chains replaced by the promise of land and dignity. It was a revolution without bloodshed, an act that changed the very soul of Russia. The people called him father. The world hailed him as enlightened. But liberation came with pain. The new peasants found themselves burdened by debt, and the nobility seethed at their loss of power. Alexander had pleased no one completely, the curse of every reformer. Still, he pressed forward. He modernized the army, reformed the courts, and expanded education. For a moment, it seemed Russia might finally join the modern world. Yet with progress came rebellion. Radical groups, inspired by the same ideals he had allowed to flourish, began to turn against him. They saw not a liberator, but a tyrant too slow to fulfill their dreams. The more he gave, the more they demanded. Assassination attempts became constant. His carriages were bombed, his guards murdered. Each time, he survived until one cold March afternoon in 1881. As he rode through the streets of St. Petersburg in an open carriage, a young revolutionary from the group People's Will threw a bomb. The explosion shattered the road and wounded his guards, but the Tsar emerged shaken yet alive. Against his advisor's pleas, he stepped from his carriage to check on the injured. That act of compassion sealed his fate. A second assassin approached and hurled another bomb. The blast tore through the Tsar's body. His legs were mangled, his chest ripped open. Still conscious, Alexander whispered, "It is too early to thank God." He was carried back to the Winter Palace, where he died moments later, surrounded by blood, broken glass, and the stunned silence of an empire. The people wept, but the dream he had begun died with him. His son, Alexander III, reversed his reforms, ruling with iron and suspicion. The hope that Russia might evolve into a freer, fairer nation was buried alongside the man who had tried to create it. And yet, history remembers Alexander II not for his end, but for his courage to change. He freed millions, knowing it might destroy him. He believed that power was not a right, but a responsibility, a belief that few rulers before or since have shared. In the place where he fell, the Russians built the Church of the Savior on spilled blood, its golden domes rising like a promise from the ashes. It stands today as both monument and warning that progress, though born from compassion, is often paid for in blood. Alexander II's life was proof that even in an empire built on fear, one man could choose mercy. His death was proof that mercy alone cannot conquer hate. But in the end, the Tsar Liberator achieved what no assassin could: destroy immortality through the freedom he gave to others. He was the storm that reshaped the world. From the steppes of Mongolia, he rose to forge the largest land empire in human history. To his followers, he was the chosen of heaven. To his enemies, he was wrath made flesh. His name was Temujin, but history remembers him as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. For decades he conquered everything before him. Yet when death finally came, it arrived not on the battlefield, but in the stillness of mystery. Born in the 12th century to a family of warriors, Temujin's childhood was marked by betrayal and hardship. His father was poisoned by rivals, his clan abandoned him, and hunger stalked his youth. But the boy who once hunted to survive learned to master men as easily as he did horses. Through cunning alliances and merciless vengeance, he united the Mongol tribes under one banner. In 1260s, he took the title Genghis Khan, the Oceanic King, Lord of all who live under the Skiseoi. What followed was unlike anything the world had seen. His armies rode like thunder across Asia, sweeping aside kingdoms and civilizations with terrifying speed. Against his tactics, there was no defense. His warriors were ghosts of the wind, striking, vanishing, striking again. Cities burned, empires fell, and entire peoples vanished into dust. To some, he was a monster. To others, a maker of order in a world of chaos. But Genghis Khan was more than a conqueror. He built systems of law, established trade routes, and welcomed scholars, healers, and thinkers from every land. He outlawed torture, rewarded loyalty, and demanded discipline. In his empire, even the poorest could rise by merit, and even kings could fall by failure. He saw himself not as a destroyer, but as a hammer, shaping the world anew. By 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific to the Caspian Sea. Genghis was invincible, or so it seemed. Yet time spares no man, not even those who command it. During a campaign against the Western Xia in China, the great Khan fell ill. Some say it was fever. Others claim he was wounded in battle. There are whispers, too, of betrayal, a hidden blade, a poisoned arrow, a secret revenge. Whatever the truth, he summoned his generals and spoke calmly of the future. His death, he said, must remain hidden. The empire must not mourn. The conquest must continue. And so it did. When Genghis Khan died, his soldiers disguised his passing with silence. They carried his body back to Mongolia, killing anyone who crossed their path to preserve the secret. They buried him in an unmarked grave, somewhere near the sacred mountains of his homeland. The location was erased from memory, guarded by legend. No monument marks his tomb. No man has ever found it. Even in death, he ruled through fear and awe. His empire expanded long after he was gone, carried forward by his descendants, who followed his code and his shadow. His sons and grandsons would build on his foundation, creating dynasties that spanned centuries, from the Golden Horde in Russia to the Yuan in China. But the source of it all, The man who had bent the earth to his will vanished into myth. For centuries, people have searched for his grave, believing that to find it would unlock the secret of his power. Yet perhaps the true secret was never buried. Genghis Khan's immortality was not in stone or treasure, but in the transformation he left behind. He redrew borders, rewired civilizations, and changed the course of history itself. His death remains one of the great enigmas of the ancient world. No witnesses, no tomb, only silence, as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. In that silence lies his final victory. The man who ruled all lands left none to claim his body. The rider who conquered death's shadow became one with it. Even now, when the wind sweeps across the Mongolian plains, the people say they can still hear his horse's hooves, galloping endlessly across the horizon. The eternal rider does not rest. He rides still unstoppable, eternal. He was the last of a dynasty and the first to fall by his own hand. Nero Claudius Caesar, emperor of Rome, was born into power and consumed by it. To his people, he was a monster. To himself, an artist misunderstood. His name became the very symbol of madness and Equus, a ruler who played while Rome burned. But behind the cruelty and chaos lay something far more human: fear. And in the end, that fear would destroy him. Nero was born in 37 AD, a child of privilege and danger. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was ambitious, ruthless, and willing to kill for her son's future. Through manipulation and marriage, she placed Nero on the throne at 16. For a time he seemed the golden boy of Rome, young, handsome, and full of promise. He lowered taxes, freed slaves, and courted the love of the masses. The Senate hailed him as the dawn of a new age. But dawns do not last forever. As Nero's power grew, so did his paranoia. He came to see enemies everywhere in generals, senators, even his own family. When his mother began to question his rule, he ordered her death. The woman who had built his empire was found murdered on the shore, stabbed by her son's command. The act shattered something in him. From that moment, Nero ceased to be a ruler and became a spectacle. He fancied himself an artist, a poet, a god among men. He performed on stage, he raced chariots in the circus, and forced Rome's elite to applaud his every verse. While the empire strained under rebellion and debt, Nero indulged in grandeur beyond imagination. Palaces of food, feasts that lasted days, rivers of wine. His empire became theater, and he its mad performer. Then came the fire. In 64 AD, flames engulfed Rome for 9 days, devouring homes, temples, and lives. Thousands perished, and rumors spread that the emperor himself had ordered it. Some claimed he stood on his balcony, watching the inferno while playing his lyre, singing of Troy's destruction. Whether true or not, the image would haunt history forever. Desperate to shift blame, Nero accused the Christians, unleashing a persecution that turned the streets red. The people who had once adored him now whispered his name with hatred. As rebellion flared across the provinces, Nero's grasp on power began to crumble. Governors and generals declared against him. The Praetorian Guard, his own protectors, deserted. Alone in the palace that had once been the center of the world, the emperor, who believed himself divine, was now hunted like a criminal. In June of 68 AD, Nero fled Rome with a handful of loyal servants. He rode through the night, disguised, trembling, until he reached a small villa on the outskirts of the city. There he heard the news. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the state. Death awaited him. The man who had condemned thousands could not face the same fate. As soldiers approached, he turned to his companion and whispered, "Is this what it means to die?" Then, with the help of a trembling hand, Nero drove a dagger into his throat. His final words were as haunting as they were human. "What an artist dies in me." When the soldiers entered, they found the last of the Julio-Claudian emperors lying lifeless on the floor. Rome did not mourn him. The streets rejoiced. The empire, exhausted by madness, sought to forget his name. But history did not forget. Nero became a legend, the mad emperor, the tyrant, the warning. Yet beneath the ruin, a strange truth remains. Nero was not the first man destroyed by power, nor the last. He was the reflection of embers itself, brilliant, ambitious, and doomed by its own excess. His death ended a dynasty, but began a myth that would outlive marble and fire alike. For centuries, false Neros would rise, claiming to be him returned. In their delusion, perhaps they spoke a kind of truth. For in the theater of history, Nero never left the stage. His life remains the ultimate tragedy, a man who mistook applause for love and found that empires, like flames, consume everything they touch. And the twilight of imperial Russia, as the Romanov dynasty crumbled under the weight of war and revolution, one man stood at the center of power and scandal. He was neither noble nor soldier, neither priest nor politician. He was something far stranger, a peasant mystic, whose name would become legend. His enemies called him a devil, his followers a holy man. But all agreed on one thing: Grigory Rasputin seemed impossible to kill. Born in a remote Siberian village in 1869, Rasputin came from the frozen wilderness that shaped men, hard and strange. He wandered the countryside as a pilgrim, claiming visions, healing the sick, and preaching repentance. His hypnotic eyes, wild beard, and crude charisma drew both fascination and fear. By the time he reached St. Petersburg, the heart of the Russian Empire, rumors of miracles followed him like shadows. It was there he met Tsarina Alexandra, wife of Tsar Nicholas II. The royal family's only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, a deadly, untreatable disease. When doctors failed, the desperate empress turned to the strange holy man from Siberia. Rasputin prayed over the boy, and the bleeding stopped. Whether by chance, faith, or hypnosis, it did not matter. To the Tsarina, it was a miracle. From that moment, Rasputin's place in the palace was sealed. As his influence grew, so did the outrage. Aristocrats whispered that the empire was being ruled not by the Tsar, but by a mad monk. Ministers and generals feared him. Church leaders called him a heretic. Yet no scandal could drive him away. He advised on appointments, whispered in Alexandra's ear, and survived countless plots against him. He drank heavily, boasted endlessly, and seemed untouchable. But empires crumble from within, and Rasputin had become the symbol of everything rotten in Russia's heart. In December 1916, a group of nobles, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, decided that his death would save the empire. What they did not know was that Rasputin's death would become one of history's strangest tales. On a freezing night in St. Petersburg, Rasputin was invited to Yusupov's palace under the pretense of meeting the prince's wife. He was served wine and cakes laced with cyanide. Hours passed. He drank, he laughed, and nothing happened. Panic set in. Yusupov retrieved a pistol and shot him in the chest. Rasputin fell. They left him for dead. When the conspirators returned to dispose of the body, the impossible happened. Rasputin stirred. His eyes opened. He rose to his feet and lunged at them, gasping for breath, clawing toward the door. Terrified they fired again and again. Bullets riddled his body, yet still he moved. Only when a final shot struck his forehead did he collapse for good. His killers wrapped him in cloth and dumped him into the frozen Neva River. Days later, when the body was found, it was twisted but strangely serene. The autopsy revealed water in his lungs. Even after poison and bullets, he had drowned. The man who would not die had defied death until his final breath. Rasputin's murderers celebrated, believing they had saved Russia. But within months, the empire fell. The Tsar was overthrown, the royal family executed, and revolution swept the nation. The death of Rasputin was not the salvation of Russia, it was its last omen. History remembers him as monster and mystic alike, the peasant who touched the throne and cursed it. Yet his story endures not just for its strangeness, but for its meaning. Rasputin embodied the chaos of his time, a world where faith and corruption, superstition and power, danced together in madness. In the end, perhaps the man who would not die never truly did. His legend survives, haunting the corridors of Russian history like a ghost that refuses to fade. Every empire has its shadow. For the Romanovs, that shadow bore the eyes of Rasputin, unblinking, eternal, and impossible to kill. He was called El Libertador, the liberator, the man who freed half a continent and dreamed of uniting it under one banner. Simón Bolívar was not just a soldier, but an idea, the embodiment of freedom with Eve. He fought kings, toppled empires, and carved nations out of tyranny. Yet when his war was won, he found himself conquered by betrayal, bitterness, and loneliness. His end was not written in battle, but in silence. Born in Caracas in 1783, Bolívar came from wealth, but not comfort. Orphaned young, he was raised by tutors who filled his mind with the ideals of the Enlightenment, liberty, equality, and destiny. He studied in Europe, where he saw the ashes of revolutions and the fragility of empires. On a hill in Rome, he swore an oath before God and history that he would not rest until Spanish rule was broken from the Americas. It was a promise that would shape his life and destroy it. When he returned home, the continent was a volcano waiting to erupt. Spain's power was crumbling, but its grip was still iron. Bolívar became the spark that lit the fire. From Venezuela to Colombia, Ecuador to Peru, he led armies through jungles, deserts, and mountains. His campaigns were miracles of endurance, crossing the Andes with barefoot soldiers, fighting battles in storms and starvation, refusing to surrender even when defeat seemed certain. He was more than a general. He was a symbol. His words inspired nations. He who serves a revolution plows the sea. The people called him savior, liberator, father of the republics. But the burden of freedom is heavy, and the unity he dreamed of began to crumble even before it was realized. After independence, Bolívar tried to forge a single nation, Gran Colombia, uniting Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama under one flag. But ambition, jealousy, and greed tore it apart. The same men who once followed him into war turned against him in peace. Assassination attempts became common. Civil wars flared. The liberator who had defeated kings could not defeat human nature. By 1830, his dream lay in ruins. Broken and ill, Bolívar resigned from power. All who served the revolution have plowed the sea, he said, and so sown nothing. He set out for exile, planning to leave for Europe. But fate would not grant him even that escape. On December 17, 1830, in a borrowed house near the coast of Santa Marta, Colombia, Simón Bolívar died of tuberculosis. He was 47 years old. He died without riches, without family, without the nation he had fought to build. The man who had liberated millions had not a single coin to his name. His body was wrapped in a simple blanket. His final words were as haunting as they were humble. If my death contributes to your happiness, may my life be taken. But death did not take his legacy. Over time, the nations he freed began to understand what he had given them and what he had lost in return. Statues rose in every capital. Cities bore his name. His dream of unity remained unfulfilled. Yet his vision endured, alive in the hearts of those who still believe freedom is worth the cost. Bolívar's life was a paradox. He fought for liberty, yet died in chains of memory. He gave birth to nations, yet died without a home. But perhaps that was always his destiny. Some men are not made to rest in peace. They are made to wander through history restless, eternal, forever reminding us that revolution does not end with victory, and that the fight for freedom never truly ends. Today, the name Simón Bolívar stands not just for a man, but for an ideal that one soul, driven by conviction, can change the fate of continents. And though he died alone, his voice still echoes through the Andes and across the rivers he once crossed, whispering to the generations that came after him, liberty is never given. It must be seized, and it must be guarded, even when the liberator himself has fallen. For centuries, Japan had been a land divided, a nation of endless wars and fleeting loyalties, where samurai lords fought for power and glory. But out of the chaos rose one man, whose patience would outlast every rival, whose vision would forge 200 years of peace. His name was Tokugawa Ieyasu, the shogun who ended an age of blood. And when he died, his death sealed the unity he had built. Born in 1543 into a world of betrayal, Ieyasu's childhood was marked by captivity and war. As a boy, he was taken hostage by rival clans, used as a pawn in the endless chess game of feudal Japan. But he learned from every hardship. Where others burned with rage, Ieyasu waited. He mastered the art of endurance, the weapon that would define his life. When he came of age, Japan was a shattered mirror. Dozens of warlords fought for dominion in a struggle known as the Sengoku period, the Warring States era. Ieyasu served powerful masters, forged alliances, and watched as men like Oda Nobunaga and Toyotomi Hideyoshi rose and fell. He studied them both, learning the lessons of ambition and restraint. Nobunaga's fire had conquered. Hideyoshi's diplomacy had ruled, but both had died before their dreams could endure. Ieyasu would succeed where they had failed. In 1600, fate called him to the battlefield at Sekigahara. Two great armies clashed in the mist, east against west, ambition against chaos. When the fog lifted, Ieyasu stood victorious. The battle was the turning point in Japan's history, and his victory laid the foundation for an empire. 3 years later, he was granted the title of shogun, becoming the supreme military ruler of Japan. Yet Ieyasu's genius was not in conquest, but in consolidation. He understood that swords could win a nation, but only wisdom could keep it. He disarmed the restless lords, built a new capital at Edo, modern-day Tokyo, and established a government so stable it would last more than 2 centuries. He rewrote the story of Japan not with war, but with patience, law, and control. Even in his old age, Ieyasu remained sharp as steel. He advised his successors, taught them the art of subtle rule, and reminded them that peace must be guarded with the same vigilance as victory. But time, even for shoguns, is undefeated. In 1616, at the age of 73, Tokugawa Ieyasu fell ill. Surrounded by his family and loyal retainers, he spoke calmly of life and death, quoting the words of a warrior long before him. Life is as fragile as the morning dew, and yet it is enough. He died with the serenity of a monk and the discipline of a soldier. His body was laid to rest at the temple of Kunuzan, overlooking the sea, but later moved to Nikko, where a grand shrine was built in his honor. There, amid forests and mountains, his spirit was enshrined as a god, Tosho Dai Gongen, the great deity of the East, protector of Japan and guardian of peace. His death was not the fall of a ruler, but the birth of an era. Under his descendants, the Tokugawa shogunate ruled Japan for over 250 years, an age of isolation, order, and prosperity. The wars that had once torn the country apart became distant memories. And though later centuries would bring change, The stability Ieyasu created became the foundation of modern Japan. History remembers him, not for daring charges or fiery speeches, but for his restraint. In a world of men who lived fast and died young, he mastered the art of waiting. He understood that true power lies not in the sword, but in the patience to sheathe it. Tokugawa Ieyasu's story is proof that sometimes victory belongs not to the boldest or the strongest, but to the one who endures. His death united Japan because his life had already taught it how. The man who spent his youth as a hostage became the master of destiny, and in death, he became its guardian. Even now, at the shrine of Nikko, the cedar trees whisper his legacy, a peace forged from chaos, a dream realized through patience, and a man who turned an age of war into an age of balance. In the misty lands of ancient Britain, where the Roman legions marched in cold discipline and iron ruled over freedom, one woman dared to defy an empire. Her name was Boudica, queen of the Iceni mother, warrior, and symbol of vengeance. To Rome, she was a barbarian. To her people, she was justice made flesh. Her uprising would shake the might of Caesar's heirs and remind the world that even empires can bleed. Boudica lived during the 1st century AD, when Britain was a Roman province under the heavy hand of occupation. Her husband, King Presutagus of the Iceni tribe, had made peace with the conquerors, ruling his people under Rome's shadow. But when he died, that fragile peace shattered. Rome seized his lands, flogged the queen, and according to the chroniclers, violated her daughters. The message was clear. There would be no mercy, no dignity, no freedom. But Rome had misjudged their victim. From her pain rose fury. From humiliation, rebellion. Boudica called the tribes to war, the Iceni, the Trinovantes, and others who had suffered under Roman rule. Under her banner, thousands gathered, united by rage and hope. She stood before them, tall and fierce, her red hair flowing like fire, her voice echoing across the fields. "The gods will grant us vengeance," she said. "We fight not as slaves, but as free people, and freedom knows no fear." In 60 AD, the rebellion began. Like a storm, Boudica's army swept through Roman Britain. The cities of Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium burned. Temples were torn down, statues toppled, and Roman soldiers cut down in the streets. It was a vengeance so fierce that even Rome trembled. Ancient writers claimed 80,000 Romans and allies were slain, a reckoning written in blood and flame. But empires do not fall easily. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, regrouped his forces. With discipline and strategy, he drew Boudica's vast army into open battle. The two forces met somewhere along the Watling Street, thousands of warriors against a few disciplined legions. The Britons charged with wild fury, but Roman shields held firm. The trap closed, and chaos turned to slaughter. Boudica's rebellion was crushed. What happened to her afterward is shrouded in legend. Some say she took poison rather than face capture. Others that she fell in battle, her body lost among her people. What is certain is that she chose death over chains. The woman who defied Rome refused to live in defeat. Rome celebrated its victory, but it came at a cost. The province lay in ruins, its cities burned, its soldiers haunted by the queen who had nearly destroyed them. Boudica became both warning and myth, a reminder of how close even the greatest empire had come to collapse at the hands of one woman. For centuries, her story was almost forgotten, buried beneath Rome's triumphs. But legends never die. When Britain later rose as an empire of its own, it rediscovered her name, Boudica, the warrior queen. Statues were built in her honor, poets sang of her courage. To generations that followed, she became the spirit of resistance, the fire that refuses to be conquered. Her rebellion failed, but her defiance endured. Boudica proved that power alone cannot rule forever, that no matter how great, will one day face its reckoning. She stood against the might of Rome, armed not with armies or wealth, but with fury and conviction. And though the flames of her rebellion were extinguished, their glow still flickers in the story of every people who have dared to fight for freedom. The queen who burned Rome's pride remains eternal, a symbol carved not in marble, but in courage. Boudica's name, whispered by the wind across the British plains, reminds us that even when empires rise, there will always be voices that stand unyielding in the face of tyranny. He was the rebel who refused to kneel, the warrior who turned defiance into legend. William Wallace, the guardian of Scotland, rose from obscurity to lead his people against one of the most powerful kings in history. His courage ignited a nation's soul, and his death turned rebellion into destiny. The English called him an outlaw. The Scots called him freedom. Born around 1270, Wallace came of age during a time of despair. Scotland had lost its king, and Edward I of England, known as the Hammer of the Scots, sought to claim it as his own. English soldiers occupied Scottish towns, levied cruel taxes, and ruled with iron and arrogance. The nobles argued, the people suffered, and hope seemed lost. Then, from the shadows, a young man stepped forward, tall, fierce, and unyielding. He carried no royal blood, only conviction. The first blow of rebellion came in Worcester when Wallace and a band of fighters attacked English garrisons. What began as guerrilla warfare became revolution. His courage spread like wildfire through the glens and hills. Soon farmers and shepherds took up arms beside him. Their cause was not wealth or land. It was the right to live free. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Wallace achieved what no one thought possible. Facing a far larger English army, he used cunning and terrain to his advantage. As the English crossed the narrow bridge, the Scots struck with ferocity, cutting them down by the hundreds. When the battle ended, the ground was soaked with victory. For the first time, Scotland stood unbroken. Wallace was hailed as guardian of the realm. But triumph is a fragile crown. The nobles who once praised him began to fear him. Rivalries and politics corroded unity. And in 1298, at Falkirk, Wallace faced Edward's might once more. This time fortune turned. English longbows darkened the sky, cutting through the Scottish ranks. Wallace escaped, but his army was shattered. He vanished into legend, hunted, hated, yet never forgotten. Years passed. Betrayal, not battle, brought him down. In 1305, he was captured near Glasgow and handed over to the English. The king who had burned his country now sought to break its spirit. In London, Wallace was dragged before a court and charged with treason. When asked to plead, he stood tall and thundered, "I could not be a traitor to Edward, for I was never his subject." His words silenced the hall. They were his last act of defiance. The sentence was brutal. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was taken to Smithfield. Before a jeering crowd, he was tortured and executed, drawn, hanged, and quartered. His body was torn apart, his limbs sent to the corners of Britain as a warning. But it did not work. The man was gone. The idea remained. In death, Wallace became immortal. His cry for freedom echoed across generations. The Scottish struggle continued, led by men inspired by his courage, men like Robert the Bruce, who would one day win the independence Wallace had died for. Centuries later, his name still burns bright in Scotland's heart. Statues rise in his honor. PhD carry his story, and the words attributed to him, freedom, ring through time like thunder. Whether he truly spoke them or not, no longer matters. They have become the voice of a people who refuse to surrender. William Wallace's life was brief, his victories few, but his legacy boundless. He proved that even one man, armed only with conviction, can challenge an empire. He showed that freedom is not granted by kings, it is claimed by those willing to die for it. The English sought to erase him from history. Instead, they ensured his immortality. The outlaw became a legend. The legend became a symbol, and the symbol became a nation's heart. And so, on the windswept fields of Scotland, where banners once flew and swords once clashed, his spirit still rides. His voice still calls, not for vengeance, but for freedom. For as long as there are people who dream of it, William Wallace will never truly die. Before Alexander the Great conquered the world, there was his father, King Philip II of Macedon, the man who forged the weapon his son would wield. He was a soldier, a visionary, and a tyrant, a ruler who turned a small fractured kingdom into the mightiest military power in Greece. Yet his own greatness would never reach its peak, because destiny demanded that he die so another could rise. His assassination was not just the end of a reign, it was the beginning of an empire. Philip was born in 382 BCC in a land scorned by its southern neighbors. To the proud city-states of Greece, Macedonia was a backwater, its kings little more than barbarians. But Philip was no ordinary prince. As a young man, he was sent as a hostage to Thebes, where he studied the art of war under the greatest generals of the age. There, he learned what made the Greek phalanx invincible and what made Greek politics fragile. When he returned home, he brought with him not only knowledge, but ambition, vast as the horizon. In 359 BC, Philip became king after his brother's death, inheriting a kingdom beset by enemies. Through cunning diplomacy and ruthless war, he transformed Macedonia in less than 2 decades. He reorganized his army, lengthened the spears, and drilled his soldiers into a force of perfect discipline. One by one, his enemies fell. Thrace, Thessaly, and even Athens bowed to his strategy and strength. By the age of 40, Philip was the master of Greece, not by divine right, but by pure will. But kings who rise too high draw shadows even in their own courts. Philip's life was filled with triumphs on the battlefield and turmoil at home. His many marriages, each for political alliance, bred jealousy, tension, and betrayal. Among his wives was Olympias, a fierce woman from Epirus, and their son Alexander, who would inherit his father's fire. Yet father and son often clashed, their pride colliding like storm and sea. Philip's new marriage to a younger bride drove a deeper wedge between them. Whispers filled the palace that the king meant to replace Alexander as heir. Still, Philip pressed forward with his dream, a grand invasion of Persia. For the first time in history, all of Greece was united under one banner. He planned to lead them east, to conquer the empire that had once threatened their freedom. It was to be his greatest campaign. But fate, as ever, had other plans. In the summer of 336 BC, Philip traveled to the city of Aigi to celebrate the wedding of his daughter. The atmosphere was joyous music, feasts, and ceremony. As the king entered the theater to take his seat, dressed in white, unarmed, and radiant with pride, a young bodyguard named Pausanias approached him. Without warning, he drew a dagger and struck. The blade pierced Philip's chest. The conqueror of Greece fell dead before his people's eyes. Pausanias was cut down trying to flee. His motives died with him. Some said he acted out of revenge for a personal grievance. Others whispered of a deeper plot, perhaps Olympias, perhaps even Alexander himself, who gained most from his father's death. The truth remains shrouded in the fog of power and time. Philip's assassination sent shockwaves through the ancient world. But within days, his 20-year-old son ascended the throne. The generals who had once served the father now swore loyalty to the son. Within 2 years, Alexander would launch the invasion Philip had planned and fulfill a destiny that began in blood. History often remembers Philip as merely the father of Alexander. But that is an injustice. Without Philip, there would have been no Alexander. He laid the foundation, trained the army, and taught his son that greatness was not inherited, it was earned through conquest and cunning. His death was tragic, but also transformative. It was the moment the torch passed from one genius to another, from a builder to a conqueror. Through his son, Philip achieved what death had denied him: immortality. Today, the ruins of Agi still stand, and beneath them lies Philip's tomb adorned with gold, his armor still gleaming, as if waiting for the march that never came. In the silence of that chamber rests the man who built the world his son would rule, the king whose final breath gave birth to legend. Philip II of Macedon lived like a lion and died like a god. His bloodline would shape empires, his death would forge destiny, and his legacy would echo through eternity, carried forever by the name of his son. He was a European prince who crossed the ocean, chasing a dream of empire, honor, and destiny. But in the sun-baked hills of Mexico, that dream would turn to dust. Emperor Maximilian I of Mexico, the man who wore a crown of thorns instead of gold, believed he could bring civilization to chaos. What he found instead was betrayal, war, and a lonely death before a firing squad. Born in 1832, Ferdinand Maximilian was the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. Charismatic, cultured, and idealistic, he loved art, science, and the sea more than politics. Yet destiny, it seemed, had grander plans. In the 1860s, Europe's great powers looked across the Atlantic with ambition. France, under Napoleon III, sought to expand its influence by installing a friendly monarch in Mexico, a country torn apart by civil war. Maximilian, noble and naive, was chosen to be that monarch. In 1864, he accepted the offer and sailed to Mexico with his wife, the Belgian Princess Carlota. As he arrived in Veracruz, crowds greeted him with cautious hope. To his eyes, he was not an invader, but a sire. He promised reform, equality, and progress. He abolished child labor, defended indigenous rights, and sought peace in a land that had known only turmoil. But ideals cannot rule a nation divided by blood. The new emperor's throne was built on sand. His power depended entirely on French bayonets, foreign soldiers who fought to keep him in place. Meanwhile, the legitimate Mexican president, Benito Juarez, led a republican resistance from the north. To the people, Maximilian was not a liberator, but a puppet of empire. His good intentions were drowned in the sound of gunfire. Then, in 1866, his fragile world began to collapse. Under pressure from the United States and drained by its own wars, France withdrew its troops. Napoleon III abandoned his creation. Carlota, desperate to save her husband, traveled to Europe to plead for help and lost her sanity in the processes. Alone and surrounded, Maximilian faced an impossible choice: flee and leave, or stay and die with honor. He chose to stay. In 1867, Republican forces under General Mariano Escobedo besieged the city of Querétaro. Maximilian, though inexperienced in war, took command of the defense. For 70 days he fought bravely, refusing to surrender. When betrayal opened the city gates, he was captured. Juarez offered him no mercy. The foreign emperor would face the same justice as any other usurper. On June 19, 1867, Maximilian was led to the Hill of the Bells, where a firing squad awaited. Dressed in a black suit, calm and composed, he addressed his executioners in Spanish. "Men of my death," he said, "I forgive everyone, and I pray that my blood may be for the good of this country. Viva Mexico." He placed a coin in each man's hand, asking them to aim at his heart. The rifles fired. The would-be emperor fell backward. His body sprawled on the earth of the land he had tried to rule. The world was shocked. In Europe, poets mourned him as a martyr. painters captured his final moments. In Mexico, the people saw something more complex, not a tyrant, but a tragic outsider who never understood the land he sought to govern. Maximilian's death ended the Second Mexican Empire and marked a turning point in the nation's struggle for self-determination. Juarez had won, but even he admitted that Maximilian had died bravely. History, as always, found room for both condemnation and respect. His story remains one of history's great ironies. A man of peace died in war. A foreign emperor dreamed of freedom. A crown meant for glory became a burden of thorns. Today, on the hill where he fell, a simple chapel stands not as a monument to empire, but as a reminder that even the noblest intentions cannot escape the weight of history. Maximilian's fate echoes across centuries, a testament to the danger of dreams born in the hearts of men who mistake hope for destiny. In the end, he was not destroyed by his enemies, but by his own ideals, too pure for politics, too gentle for power, too late for redemption. And as the rifles fired that morning in Querétaro, the last echo of Europe's imperial ambition faded into the winds of the New World. For more than 1,000 years, the city of Constantinople stood as the bridge between worlds, where East met West, where empires rose and fell beneath its golden domes. It was the heart of Byzantium, the last spark of Rome, and its fate was bound to one man, Emperor Constantine the Palaiologos. His death would mark not just the end of a kingdom, but the end of an age. Born in 1405, Constantine was the last in a long line of emperors who had watched their empire shrink from the vast dominion of Rome to a single, fragile city. Surrounded by enemies, betrayed by time, he ruled a realm of memories, but ruled it with dignity. To his people, he was both emperor and guardian, the final defender of a world slipping into legend. The enemy at his gates was Mehmed II, the 21-year-old Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, brilliant, ruthless, and determined to finish what his ancestors had begun. In 1453, he marched with an army of over 100,000 men and massive cannons that could shatter walls thought unbreakable. Inside the city, barely 7,000 defenders prepared to meet them. The odds were hopeless, but Constantine would not flee. As the siege began, the sound of bombardment echoed across the Bosporus. Day after day, the great walls of Theodosius trembled under fire. Yet the defenders held on, Greeks, Venetians, Genoese, and ordinary citizens standing side by side. At night, Constantine walked the ramparts, speaking softly to his soldiers, blessing them, and fighting beside them when the battle came. For 55 days, the city endured. But on May 29, 1453, as dawn broke, the Ottomans launched their final assault. Waves of soldiers crashed against the walls. The defenders fought with desperate fury, but the breaches grew wider. In the chaos, Constantine threw off his imperial robes and shouted, "The city is lost, but I live." Sword in hand, he charged into the fray. No one saw him fall. Some said he was cut down by enemy blades. Others claimed he was buried beneath the bodies of his comrades, still fighting. His body was never found. Only his broken crown was said to have been discovered later among the ruins, a symbol of the empire's end. As the Ottomans entered the city, the streets fell silent. The Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, became a mosque. The banner of Byzantium, the double-headed eagle, was lowered for the last time. The Roman Empire, which had begun with Augustus 15 centuries earlier, was no more. But in that defeat, something eternal was born. The legend of Constantine XI, the emperor who died with his people, became a beacon of faith and defiance. To Greeks, he was not a fallen ruler, but a sleeping king, the marble emperor destined to rise again when the time was right. His sacrifice transformed catastrophe into myth. History would remember Mehmed as the conqueror, but Constantine was the heart of a civilization that refused to die. Even in ruins, Constantinople remained a bridge of cultures, a city reborn again and again under different names and flags. Its spirit and his endured. The fall of Constantinople marked the close of the Middle Ages and the dawn of the modern world. Yet in that moment of ending, one man stood as the last light of an ancient flame. He could have fled to safety, but chose to remain not as emperor, but as a soldier. His courage gave meaning to defeat, turning it into something timeless. Today, the city he defended still stands, Istanbul, a living monument to his final stand. Beneath its towers and domes lies the echo of that last battle, and perhaps, somewhere deep within the stones, the spirit of the emperor who would not surrender. Constantine XI. Polyphilagos died as the Romans had lived, fighting, proud, unbroken. His death did not end Rome. It completed its story. And though empires rise and fall, legends endure. As long as the walls of that city touch the sea, the ghost of its last emperor will walk them still, guarding the memory of the world that was.